Red Bull are once again at the top of the F1 mountain after a dominant display by Max Verstappen to win the 2022 World Drivers' Championship, and along with Sergio Perez they were able to capture the Constructors' Championship, which was the first Constructors' Championship for Red Bull since 2013. Things right now are looking perfect for the team, but it was not always that way, and the team has come a very long way since the beginning, and today I'm going to be talking about the rise, the fall, and the resurgence of the Red Bull F1 team. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more F1 content. Over 80% of my viewers are not currently subscribed to my channel, and if you're one of those, I really hope I can convince you to subscribe, as I have a lot of F1 content to bring your way. Now, let's get to the video. In September 2004, Jaguar announced that they're going to be putting their F1 team up for sale. This came about because their parent company at the time, Ford, decided that competing in Formula 1 was no longer making any business sense. And well, that is kind of fair enough because Jaguar was for the most part not producing any stellar results with drivers like Mark Webber and Christian Klien. Dietrich Mateschitz stepped up and purchased a team for $1. Yep, that's right, just $1, not even $1 million. This $1 would arguably change F1 forever. Now, there was a contractual clause that Red Bull had agreed to, which would see that they would invest $400 million into the team over the course of 3 years. This $1 purchase would see Red Bull join the F1 grid in 2005. As part of the sale, Red Bull would have access to the Cosworth V10 engines for 2005, and the team dropped Mark Webber for David Coulthard, who was departing the McLaren team. But that would be all important to the early days of Red Bull. DC was getting to the back end of his career, and he knew at this point his time at the front of the grid was pretty much over, so he joined Red Bull to help build the team up for the future. His experience would be crucial to the future. As well as this, DC's contacts would, let's say, play a vital role to the future of the team. As far as debut seasons go, Red Bull's debut season in 2005 was a success. The team finished 7th in the Constructors, but were very close to finishing in 6th place. Now, this doesn't sound too impressive, especially when you consider that Jaguar also finished in 7th place in 2004, but this was a success. The team scored 34 points in 2005, whereas they only scored 10 points in 2004. David Coulthard, along with his epic chin, was able to score 24 points that season, and he had 4 DNFs to his name, as well as a DNS, but we don't need to talk about the DNS because the 2005 American Grand Prix was a bit of a farce. His teammates Christian Klien and Vitantonio Liuzzi together scored the other 10 points and also had 4 DNFs between them, so there was 8 DNFs for that team that year. For the mid-2000s, that is pretty respectable. Now, do you remember earlier when I said that DC had some useful contacts that would be vital to the rise of Red Bull? Well, in November of 2005, Red Bull hired former McLaren technical director Adrian Newey, which was seen by many to be a big move by Red Bull, showing everyone that they meant business. Unfortunately though, he did join a little bit too late to be able to help with the 2006 car. For 2006, Red Bull had switched from Cosworth to Ferrari power, which is something that is almost impossible to imagine today. It also meant that we got to see Mattia Binotto in Red Bull, which is something that is also almost impossible to imagine today. Would 2006 be better for the team though? Well, no, it really was not. 2006 was a very difficult year for Red Bull. The success of 2005 was very quickly forgotten due to the car being parked at the side of the track a lot. And I mean a lot that season. In 2005, the team had 8 DNFs. In 2006, though, that increased to 12 DNFs. Not only this, but the team scored a measly 16 points. That being said, there was one highlight for the season, and that came at the Monaco Grand Prix, where David Coulthard somehow managed to score a podium for Red Bull. Although this also had its negatives, as this meant that we had to see a naked Christian Horner jumping into a pool, and yeah, that is as disgusting as you would imagine. By the end of the season though, David Coulthard had 5 points finishers and finished in 13th, whereas his teammate Christian Klien had 2 points finishers and finished down in 18th. For Red Bull though, they were hoping 2007 would be a stronger season, as this will be the first full year with an Adrian Newey designed car. For 2007, Red Bull had once again changed engine suppliers, and this was a negative for the team. At this time in the V8 era, the top 3 engine suppliers were Ferrari, Mercedes, and BMW. Red Bull for 2007 had changed from Ferrari power to Renault power. But that being said, 2007 was a slight improvement for the team. The driver side of things was a big improvement. David Coulthard was still the number 1 driver, but now his teammate was Mark Webber, and it started to look like things were slowly falling into place for the team. Much like in 2006, the team was able to score a podium, but this time it was Mark Webber who scored the podium at the Nürburgring in Germany. The team scored 24 points overall and finished 5th in the Constructors' Championship. Reliability-wise though, it was still difficult for them, as DC had 7 DNFs and Mark Webber also had 7 DNFs, meaning that as a team they had 14 DNFs, which is an increase from 2006, so yeah, they were still parked at the side of the track quite a lot that year. DC scored 14 points and Mark Webber scored 10 points. 6 of course, which came from his podium at the Nürburgring, but it's still a better season than 2006. In 2008, the winds of change were starting to blow for Red Bull. David Coulthard, who was their number 1 driver for the first few years, had definitely taken a step back this season, and the Red Bull team was beaten by their sister team, Toro Rosso. The Toro Rosso car was essentially the same car as the Red Bull, except it was powered by Ferrari instead of Renault. But on the bright side, reliability had started to improve, as DC had only 5 retirements and Mark Webber only had 3 retirements. But DC this season really struggled for pace. He scored points only twice all year. But one of those 2 points finishes was a podium at the Canadian Grand Prix, so there was at least a bright side to his season, and the second points finish was at the first ever Singapore Grand Prix. With this, DC finished in 16th place in the Drivers' Championship with only 8 points, whereas his teammate Mark Webber scored 21 points. Both drivers were beaten by Red Bull's future star, a certain German driver named Sebastian Vettel. Vettel in the Toro Rosso won the Italian Grand Prix and scored 35 points that season to finish 8th in the Drivers' Championship and, as a reward, land a seat at Red Bull for 2009. Now we are getting into the glory years for Red Bull Racing, starting in 2009. The winds of change had fully blown across Red Bull by now at the start of the new aerodynamic era for F1. Along with this, David Coulthard had retired and made way for Sebastian Vettel to partner Mark Webber. This year, Red Bull had finally broken out from being a midfield team and was now one of the powerhouses of the sport. 2009 was a fantastic year for Red Bull, finishing 2nd in the Constructors' Championship and scoring 153.5 points, with Vettel scoring 84 points and Mark Webber scoring 69.5 points. Nice. The team scored 6 victories this season. Vettel won 4 races and Mark Webber won 2 races. At the start of the season, they were clearly the second best team, but by the end of the year, Red Bull were the class of the field, as they had perfected the double diffuser that made world champions Brawn so powerful at the beginning of the year. Brawn may have taken the championship, but the Bulls had just been awoken, and 2010 was going to be a special season. For 2010, there was another rule change which would affect how the teams would operate this season. Refueling, which had been in the sport since 1994, was banned, and the cars had to once again complete the entire race without refueling. Red Bull from the outset was the fastest car. They dominated the field when it came to qualifying. However, reliability at the early stages was creeping in with the team. Not just reliability, but the car struggled more than Ferrari and Mclaren when they were loaded up with fuel, which meant that they did not win until round 3 in Malaysia. Once they sorted out though those reliability woes, the raging bull was off. Red Bull won 9 races that season and won the Constructors' Championship, and Sebastian Vettel won his first Formula 1 World Championship by taking the lead of the championship in the very last race. Yes, Seb had not led the championship at all until the end of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. It was looking for a while like his teammate Mark Webber would be the one to win the championship, but after South Korea, Sebastian Vettel did not look back. In Brazil and Abu Dhabi, he dominated both races. He won the championship, whilst Mark Webber finished in 3rd place, just 14 points behind Vettel. The Red Bull reign had begun. 2011 was a dominant year for Sebastian Vettel. He nailed the change from Bridgestone to Pirelli tyres better than any other driver except maybe Jenson Button. Vettel this season was in a class of one. Despite overtaking aids such as DRS and KERS being introduced fully, no one could get close to stop Sebastian. Vettel won 11 races that year, and Webber won 1 race. Red Bull took pole position at every single race except for one in South Korea. There's really not anything else to say except Sebastian Vettel danced around each circuit, waving his finger around whilst everyone else was struggling with the tyres. Vettel had 392 points, and Jenson Button, who finished in second place, had 270. 2012 was a more challenging year for Red Bull. In 2011, Red Bull had the best off-throttle blown diffuser, but due to regulation changes which altered the positioning of the exhaust to try and stop this, Red Bull had lost a lot of rear downforce. This particularly hurt Sebastian Vettel early on in the season, and it was clear that Mark Webber could handle these changes a little better than Seb, but Seb was still much better at getting the car off the line and also managing the Pirelli tyres, which meant that Seb was still more of a factor than Mark Webber. Red Bull did not win 12 races this year. Instead, they only won 7 races, and for Red Bull, it took a while to win their first race. In 2009, it took 3 races. In 2010, it also took 3 races. In 2011, they won first time out, but in 2012, it took a very long 4 races to win. And for Vettel, this was his only win until the Singapore Grand Prix much later in the year. Mark took the 2 wins in between Bahrain and Singapore, but from Singapore, Vettel won all 4 races in Asia. In Abu Dhabi, Vettel started last but finished in 3rd place, and in Brazil, Vettel was hit at the start of the race and it looked like the championship would go to Fernando Alonso and Ferrari. But no, Vettel was able to recover and finish in P6, which was enough for him to win the World Championship by 3 points. Red Bull also won the Constructors' Championship from Ferrari, who finished in 2nd. So in 2012, they were just able to retain the championships. 2013 was the 4th and final championship winning season for Sebastian Vettel and Red Bull, and arguably this was the most dominant season Sebastian Vettel had in F1. Things started off pretty well for Vettel with a podium in Australia and then taking victory, albeit somewhat controversially, in Malaysia when the infamous Multi-21 incident occurred and Vettel denied Webber from winning the race, despite team orders instructing Vettel to stay behind him. But from there, Vettel was off. Of the 21 races that year, Vettel was on the podium 18 times, and he won 13 races that year and won 9 races in a row from Belgium all the way up until the last race in Brazil. Vettel wrapped the championship up with 4 races to go in India and ended the season on 397 points. His teammate Mark Webber did not win a single race that year and finished in 3rd place with 199 points. In 2014, the regulations of Formula 1 dramatically changed. Downforce was reduced by a reduction in the length of the front wing and a reduction in the size of the rear wing. Not only this, but the exhaust also changed, from 2 down to 1 main exhaust pipe, and that was to be positioned out of the back in the centre, so no longer could it be used to blow hot exhaust gases into the diffuser for more downforce. But that was not the biggest change. The biggest change was the new power unit to replace the V8 engine. Gone was a 2.4 litre screaming V8, and in its place a 1.6 V6 hybrid turbo. Gone was the small KERS systems. In its place, a complex hybrid system using an MGU-K, MGU-H and turbocharger. This was the new era, and Red Bull's engine supplier Renault got it horribly wrong. The first year with the new power unit, Red Bull was woefully unreliable and underpowered, but it was not just Renault's fault. Adrian Newey was unwilling to compromise on aerodynamics to allow the Renault engine to breathe. This meant that the car would consistently overheat and break down. Alongside this, the driver lineup also changed. Mark Webber had retired at the end of the season after a difficult year not winning a single race, and seemingly he had fallen out with Sebastian Vettel. In his place was another Aussie, But this Aussie, for some reason, couldn't stop smiling. Yes, Daniel Ricciardo was promoted from Toro Rosso to Red Bull, and in his first race it was clear that Red Bull was no longer the Sebastian Vettel team. During this difficult season, Red Bull had 5 DNFs to their name. Now, that might not sound like many when compared to the early days, however mixing this with the fact that Renault was just down on power meant that they could do nothing in the fight against Mercedes and Mercedes-powered cars like Mercedes themselves, Williams, Force India and McLaren. This being said, there was still some highlights for the team. They won 3 races that year, all in the hands of the new driver Daniel Ricciardo, winning in Canada, Hungary and Belgium. But for Seb, he only managed 4 podium seasons all year. Red Bull still finished second in the Constructors' Championship, with Ricciardo finishing third in the Drivers and Vettel all the way down in P5. After this, Vettel was off to the Scuderia to fulfill his dream of driving and winning for Ferrari. And well, he almost achieved winning the Drivers' Championship. Now we move on to 2015, and the replacement for Sebastian Vettel was announced, and it was none other than Daniel Kvyat from Toro Rosso. At the time, there was a bit of confusion as to why Kvyat was chosen over Verne, as Jeff was pretty handy. He beat Kvyat in 2014 and was only narrowly beaten by Ricciardo in 2013. But no matter, Kvyat stepped up to the team, and 2015 was, well, it was a disaster. There is no other way around it. Red Bull fell back in the pack, and it seemed like Adrian Newey was contemplating leaving. He was seen less and less at the track, and it was stated at the time that he wanted to work on other projects, meaning that F1 was no longer his real focus. And this can be seen by the fact that Red Bull only stepped on the podium 3 times all year, with Ricciardo having 2 podiums and Kvyat only having 1 podium. Kvyat, though, did beat Ricciardo in the standings, but it was only to 7th place, with Ricciardo finishing down in 8th place, and Red Bull dropped to 4th in the Constructors, behind Williams and Ferrari, and of course Mercedes, who dominated the Constructors' Championship. 2016 had to be an improvement, because there was concerns at the time about Red Bull leaving F1, and this would be a disaster for the sport, as that would mean there would be 2 less teams, because they would almost certainly take Toro Rosso with them. And well, in 2016, F1 was a lot less desirable than it is today in 2023. Thankfully though, 2016 was a better year, and Red Bull started to show signs of improvement, as was the Renault power unit as well. Ricciardo managed to score pole position on the streets of Monte Carlo, and also the team scored 2 victories that year. Firstly, they dropped Kvyat in Spain due to some poor results. Or at least that was the excuse they had given for dropping Kvyat, because of course Kvyat did get a podium the race before Russia in China. They dropped him for this kid. I don't know if you've ever heard of him before. He's called Max Verstappen, and well, on debut for Red Bull, Max Verstappen won the Spanish Grand Prix. Now, I admit he had a bit of assistance when the Mercedes duo decided to take each other out, but Max still had to fight for that victory and fend off from Ferrari's Kimi Räikkönen all the way, and he did that to take victory. They also claimed victory number 2 in Malaysia, but this time it was Ricciardo who stood on the top step of the podium. Red Bull was back to finishing P2 in the Constructors' Championship, but that being said, they were still 300 points off of Mercedes at the top of the standings. Surely things are now starting to get better, right? Renault are improving, the car's clearly getting better. Well, 2017 was not the best year for Red Bull. Renault decided it wanted to start imploding every other race, and this can be seen by the fact that the 2 drivers had a mega 13 retirements that year. In fact, Max Verstappen had 3 retirements in a row. This led, of course, to the infamous row, which led to Renault engines now being badged as Tag Heuer for 2018. That being said, with 12 podiums and 3 victories, when the car did finish races and it was not blowing up, it was a good race car. Ricciardo and Verstappen finished 5th and 6th respectively in the championship, and Red Bull finished 3rd in the Constructors. Not a great year. It was worse than 2016, but when the car did work, it was arguably a much better car than it was in 2016. For 2018, as I mentioned, Red Bull had rebranded the Renault power unit to Tag Heuer, and the junior team Toro Rosso took Honda power units, signalling that there was a change about to happen, and Red Bull's time with Renault was drawing to a close, and this for me was important for the resurgence of Red Bull, but more on that later. For 2018, Red Bull was still lacking severely in the reliability department, and the team suffered 12 retirements. Now, they were not all reliability related, as for example in Baku when Max blocked Ricciardo in the braking zone, causing Ricciardo to lock up and wipe them both out, but reliability was still a major issue with the team. But still, that being said, they had 4 wins that year, 2 from each driver, and 13 podiums. So it was still an improvement over 2017. The team, however, finished 3rd once again in the Constructors' Championship, but Max was now 4th in the Drivers' Championship, with Ricciardo in 6th place. But by the end of the season, there was now a feeling that the team was moving to suit a certain Dutch driver more than the Aussie, which meant for 2019, once again, the driver pairing at Red Bull would change. 2019 was a big change year for Red Bull. Red Bull switched from Renault to Honda power units, which up to that point had been a massive risk. McLaren had Honda power units, but their reliability made the 2017 Red Bull look bulletproof. But it was a risk that paid off. Max Verstappen was now partnered with Pierre Gasly for the season. Gasly was promoted after demolishing Brendan Hartley in 2018. And reliability-wise, Red Bull actually had massive improvement for 2019. It seemed that the Honda risk had paid off. The power unit supplier and Adrian Newey were able to work together, and this meant that Red Bull was much stronger. They only suffered 3 retirements all year. Not only this, but Max secured 3 victories and 9 podiums that season. For Pierre Gasly though, things were not so good. He was massively off the pace of Max Verstappen as the car was clearly not suited to him, and after the Hungarian Grand Prix, Pierre was demoted back to Toro Rosso and Alex Albon was promoted to Red Bull, but neither driver could get close or match Max Verstappen. Max finished 3rd in the Drivers' Championship and the team were once again 3rd in the Constructors, but it did feel like they had finally moved forward. In 2020, the season was delayed and reduced due to the COVID pandemic, but when the season got underway, it was clear that the fight at the front was between 2 drivers, Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. Occasionally though, Max Verstappen would get involved and shake things up a bit. Max had a brilliant 2020 season, finishing on the podium every time he finished a race except for once, which was in Turkey. He claimed 2 victories in the shortened season, but his teammate Alex Albon had a dreadful season and was a very long way behind Max Verstappen. Red Bull was now clearly the 2nd fastest car as Ferrari fell backwards, but even with that, Alex Albon only finished 7th in the Drivers' Championship, being beaten by a Racing Point, a Renault, and a McLaren driver, but he did still manage 2 podiums. Red Bull vaulted up to P2 in the Constructors' Championships, but they were still 250 points behind Mercedes. We are now in the Resurgence era of Red Bull and the 2021 season. Originally, the cars that debuted in 2022 were going to debut in 2021, but due to COVID, that was suspended. But unless you're a member of Team LH or a Mercedes fan, then you would be glad that the rules were delayed. 2021 was one of the greatest seasons of all time, an on-track fight that went all the way from lap 1 of the first race to the final lap of the final race. In testing, it seemed like Red Bull had overtaken Mercedes and was now the fastest car in F1. Red Bull once again had a new driver lineup with Max Verstappen's new teammate being Sergio Perez, who was dropped by Racing Point despite him winning the Sakhir Grand Prix in 2020. In Bahrain at the start of the year, Lewis Hamilton took the fight to Max Verstappen and actually beat Max despite Red Bull clearly being the faster car. This was the story of the year though. These 2 drivers were in a league of their own and they were clearly way ahead of their teammates. Max Verstappen won 10 races that year and Sergio Perez only managed 1 race victory in Baku. Not only this, but Max Verstappen was on the podium every single race he finished except for 1 in Budapest. But he did have 3 retirements that season, but none of those was due to the power unit. In Baku, his tyre failed, sending him into the wall and out of the race. In Silverstone, he was fired into the wall at Copse after colliding with Lewis Hamilton, and in Monza, Max went for a bit of a risky move around the outside of Lewis into the Rettifilo, taking both drivers out of the race. But once again, Red Bull won a championship. Max Verstappen won the Drivers' Championship in controversial fashion, scoring 395.5 points, but Red Bull lost the Constructors' Championship to Mercedes. For the Resurgence to be complete, they still had to win that Constructors' Championship. For 2022, the cars underwent another regulation change, this time designed to improve the racing by getting rid of a lot of the aerodynamic barge boards from the previous era, and Red Bull absolutely nailed the regulation change. In the beginning, it looked like Ferrari may have had the better car, as Red Bull suffered with reliability, with 3 retirements in the first 3 races. But after this, Max Verstappen was unstoppable. Max won 15 races, and Sergio Perez also won 2 races. It seemed like nothing would stop Max this year. Max absolutely dominated the championship, winning with 4 races to spare and scored 454 points. Sergio Perez finished in 3rd place with 305 points, which meant that Red Bull claimed their first Constructors' Championship from 2013. Red Bull had finally completed the Resurgence. But the question is, what will happen next as F1 moves into the 2023 season? Will their domination continue, or will the likes of Ferrari and Mercedes take the fight to Red Bull? Let me know down below,